I'm Jerry Beasley. I live in Montgomery now. I grew up in Clayton in Barber County, actually born in Texas, in Tyler, Texas. My dad was a salesman. My mother and dad lived there, and I just happened to be born in Texas. Lived there for 2 years, came back to Barber County where my family had come to the state, well, probably at 18, 19, and had farmed there up until my dad died in 1970, in the 70s. I practice law here in Montgomery now. At one time, I was temporarily insane and served as lieutenant governor, and I was totally out of my element at that point, but I did stay there for several years, served as lieutenant governor at the same time that George Wallace was governor. Actually, deciding to be a lawyer was really not planned early on. Actually, I was in the Alabama National Guard, student at Auburn, doing extension work, and I started doing some extension work that dealt with the judicial system, with military law, really, and got interested in it. At that time, I really had no idea that later on I'd be practicing law. Nobody in my family had been a lawyer. In fact, my dad farmed. My granddad in Barber County farmed, and I had had sort of a checkered career as a student myself. Insofar as college, I first went to the University of Georgia on a football scholarship, got hurt and wound up at a junior college in Mississippi, played there the rest of the year, got hurt again and dropped out of school. I was out for 2 years before I went back. I went back to Auburn then, and that's when I really had my first experience with anything connected with the legal system. So while in school, I got married. I married Sarah Baker from Adamsville, Alabama. We lived in Auburn until I graduated there. And by that time, I had decided that I wanted to try law school. And again, I had no plans insofar as what I would do in the event I was fortunate enough to graduate. So we moved to Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama Law School. And there I really got through as quick as I could. I went straight through summers and all, graduated a little bit early. Took a job in Tuscaloosa as a defense lawyer with a small insurance defense firm and did that for almost 3 years. Moved back to Clayton, my hometown, and went into a practice with A.B. Robertson. We practiced together for a year and frankly just had a total difference of opinion on almost everything. So for the good of both of us, we split up and I became a sole practitioner at that time. It goes back to the type of law practice that I was doing in Clayton in Barber County. By that time, I had developed an interest in being a trial lawyer. In Clayton, the opportunities were limited. I was having to do wills, deeds, real estate transactions, all sorts of anything that walked in the office. I really was getting somewhat bored, just to be quite frank and honest about it. And a friend of mine, Tom Coker, called me. This would have been probably in late 1967, and asked me would I be interested in helping out in the Jim Allen Senate campaign. He was running for the U.S. Senate, had been lieutenant governor. Prior to that time, I really had a limited interest in politics. I had worked for Lurleen Wallace in her campaign and did some speaking for them and some work for them, for her specifically, and sort of got, I guess, a little bit of interest in maybe looking further. So when this opportunity came with the Allen campaign, I took it. So they made me campaign manager because of the fact that I had the contacts through the Lurleen Wallace campaign of people all over the state. So I worked for the Allen campaign, and he was successful. And as a matter of interest, George Wallace, who at that time was not governor, his wife was, but he felt like he was, and the public perceived him as governor. He was actually for Armstead Selden in that race and very much against Jim Allen. And he and I had a confrontation over that one Saturday morning in the governor's mansion. He had the secretary call me to meet with him about the campaign. And I assumed that the meeting was going to be about him helping his former Lieutenant Governor, Jim Allen, become a U.S. Senator. Didn't take me about maybe 2 minutes to find out that that was a very, very much an erroneous conclusion on my part. The conversation started by him cussing out Jim Allen, calling him everything you can imagine, and what a low-down scoundrel he was, and how ungrateful, how disloyal he was. And again, this was all Greek to me because I assumed that a governor and lieutenant governor were somewhat close. And he began to tell me how Jim Allen had not helped him on the succession bill and that he could be governor. And of course, his wife was. But he instructed me that I would get out of that campaign, that I could not go further. And I refused. I told him I just couldn't do it because I first of all, liked Jim Allen, had gotten to know him and respected him. And so we left there sort of, you might say we were in disagreement, to put it mildly. So I finished out that campaign with the Allen group. He was elected. I go back to Clayton. So I was encouraged by some people to consider running for political office statewide, even though I had not held any office and really had never even run for anything. So I thought about it, and I thought about what's out there. And obviously it was not governor. So I thought about attorney general since I was a lawyer. When I found out that Bill Beasley was interested in the same job, he and I had talked. And in his persuasive manner, he convinced me that I needed to be in another race, and I agreed with him. So I decided to look at the lieutenant governor's race. I had no idea that the lieutenant governor at that time was a part-time job, presiding over the Senate only, as your primary and only real responsibility. So I got into a race that I really didn't understand, had no concept of what I was really going to face. And interestingly, looking back in retrospect, the total cost of that campaign to me and my dad, who loaned me $5,000, was approximately $17,000 for a primary, runoff, and general election. And I'm going to give some of these politicians some free advice. Learn how to, quote, use the media. And it's so different now. Then UPI was one of the services, AP, UPI. And there was a young guy named Lonnie Falk who had a TV program in Tuscaloosa, an educational type program. And he invited me to be on the program. He actually invited all the candidates, and I accepted and was the only one who participated. And after it was over, he said that he liked what I had to say, liked what I projected. And he asked me if I needed any help. And I said, sure. He said, well, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. Get your secretary to call me at a certain time every morning. Give me a one paragraph, one subject news release, and I'll see that it gets out on the wire services and the various media outlets. I told him, well, I didn't have a secretary, but I said, how about my wife? So Sarah did this every morning. I would write out or either call her and give her a one subject, one paragraph news release. And sure enough, for the rest of that campaign, every day I got free news coverage all over the state of Alabama, newspaper, radio, TV, and nobody could figure out how in the world I was getting it. Nobody else was. And I give Lonnie Falk credit for putting me in the political office that I won that year. I take office in 1971. Again, really didn't have any idea what I was getting into. McDowell Lee was Secretary of the Senate. He called me, and he was from Barber County, and I'd known him growing up. He called and said, Jere said, you fixing to get yourself in a real mess. And he said, you need some help. Said, I'll help you if you'll accept my offer of help. He was Secretary of the Senate, knew the rules. He was really a walking encyclopedia insofar as the Senate rules, both written and precedent. So I said, sure, I need the help, and I'd accept your offer. So I would come up one day, sometimes 2 days a week for that month, and he would drill me with everything that I was going to face insofar as rules first, and then situations would involve those rules. And I give him credit for at least allowing me to survive as presiding officer. And we had some really, really tough times. Governor Wallace, the assassination attempt occurred very early in my political career, and that changed everything for me. In fact, my family had gone with me. We went down to Disney, is it Disney World in Florida? Right. And really, when I was speaking at some convention and took them along with me. And when we flew back into Montgomery, I get a telephone call. And the call was that Governor Wallace had been shot. And first they said that he'd been assassinated. So that obviously came as a shock. And he and I had political differences in my first year, as everybody in Alabama at that time knew publicly. So I found out the state troopers come get me, take me to the Capitol, send my family home. And I get there and find that he was not deceased. He was still alive, but in critical condition. And it really came as a real shock. And I did not only shock to me, but I learned a lot during that process. And looking back, taught me a lot about loyalty, for example. I found that a lot of the people who had been very much pro-Wallace and some very much anti-Jere Beasley because of our split, all of a sudden became very much pro-Jere Beasley, thinking that Governor Wallace was not going to make it through the night, really. So I'm still at the Capitol. It's probably about 8 o'clock, maybe 8:30. And I'm not sure you know this, but the wire services had put out erroneously a saying that George Wallace had died. And they had to pull it back very quickly. I don't think it ever really got out to any outlet, but we had it. And the people downstairs in the governor's office, my office is on the second floor, all of his, I'm going to call them cronies, politely, were in there conspiring on how they were going to stay on and keep their power. And so I had a friend who was also a friend of the governor's. And his name was Jack Tatum from Opelika. And I asked Jack to go downstairs and sort of find out really what was going on with the, quote, Wallace crony group. And he came back up after a while and said, they're all for you now. They all think the governor is deceased, and they're trying to figure out a way to curry favor and stay in power. And that taught me a lot, really, about human nature and about loyalty and disloyalty and changes of allegiance. And it's really helped me in later years. But the next several days, you ask about me being acting governor. Interestingly, when they sent me the notice on the because of the requirement after a certain period of days you become acting governor, they sent it to me by telegram and misspelled my name. Instead of Jere, it was Jerry, and I framed that and kept it. So I come back, and the first thing, I have a meeting of the cabinet the next morning and tell them, first of all, that there would be no changes, that I was not trying to take over. I was simply a caretaker, and that I assumed that Governor Wallace was going to survive, even though, to be very candid, he had many days that nobody thought that he was during the next weeks. But the period of time that I spent as acting governor were the best days Alabama's ever had, because I didn't do anything to hurt the state, because I didn't do a single doggone thing. I had every opportunity. In fact, if I'd been a Richard Nixon type and taped conversations and taped meetings, there'd been some very people that would be concerned about their future penal possibilities, because all sorts of offers were made, all sorts of deals proposed, and I would quickly cut them off, and no interest from me. And but again, that taught me a valuable lesson also. I learned from my mother, Florence Camp Beasley, who was probably the smartest person I've ever dealt with, who died when I was 15 years old. But she taught me some valuable people lessons during that time up until her death when I was only 15. And she taught me, first of all, to respect people, to understand the situations that people find themselves in. And she told me this, and I'll never forget it. She said, "Son, don't ever get too big for your britches." And that's a pretty doggone good thing to remember. I'll take it back before I became lieutenant governor, growing up in Clayton. Uh, I remember when Governor Wallace appointed the person who became the head of the state troopers from Eufaula. And my dad was talking to me about it. And he said, "Son," said, "Governor Wallace has made a terrible mistake." Said, "This particular man has no business being in charge of a law enforcement group that's going to be thrust into a situation where there is a great deal of turmoil at that time from a civil rights standpoint. Just not as bad as today, to be quite honest with you, but the same type situation." And he told me, he said, if he ever gets in a situation where he's got to control a crowd or deal with any type protest, he's going to blow it. And he didn't say blow it, but that he's not going to be capable of handling it. And he would actually, it's like putting kerosene on a fire, putting him in charge of the troopers. And I thought about that after what transpired and how law enforcement people reacted during the early parts of the Selma situation. And I give him some credit for it, but not all, but some. In Clayton, practicing law, I can remember a lot of situations that took place there. In fact, to give you a case in point, the lynchings that occurred in Alabama, a number of them occurred right there in Barber County, and I didn't even know it. I didn't know they had actually happened until later on. In fact, I knew some of the families that were involved when I later found out about it years later, and have learned even more since because of what's happened here in Montgomery, the bringing everything into the forefront, so to speak. But growing up in a rural area of Barber County of the state, in an agricultural situation, I would work. I farmed for 2 years when I dropped out of school. I worked with black men who were older than me, and we became like not only friends, we became like kinfolks, working together, sweating together, doing everything together. And I back up a little bit. I remember one night I was in the movie theater in Clayton called the Picture Show back in those days, and I looked up in the balcony and saw Benny Dorsey, young black man that I played baseball with, not organized, but unorganized baseball. Until it got organized, then he couldn't play and I could. And I saw Benny sitting upstairs, and I was probably at that time 12 maybe. And I asked my mom, I said, "Why is Benny up there?" She said, "Shh." Said, "I'll explain it to you." And after we got home that night, she gave me a good lesson on civil rights and how things needed to change and how had not changed at that time, and we were going to pay for it down the road. And that prophecy came to pass. One of the greatest men that I've ever had any experience with. Uh, I would tell you one story that happened when I was in college, and I can't put an exact time frame on a specific time uh, in the context. I do know that I was a student at Auburn, and I would work on the weekends back in my hometown in a warehouse, cotton peanuts, and they would buy pecans during the pecan season. And I was in there that Saturday morning. It had to be George Wallace was then Circuit Judge George Wallace. Frank Johnson was federal judge at that time in Montgomery. And I didn't even know who Frank Johnson was at the time, to be very candid and honest. I did know George Wallace because I'd grown up in Clayton, and he, being from Clio, became first legislator and then circuit judge. So I knew him in that capacity. So I'm in there working that day on a Saturday morning, early in the morning, and this car comes flying up to the warehouse, slams on the brakes, and this man jumps out. He comes into the warehouse building, hadn't shaved, had an overcoat on, his hair looked like rats had slept in it, and he was hollering out to Judge Marshall Williams Sr., who had been sheriff, county commission chairman, and I think at that time probate judge, but in some order that was his political career. Probably the best politician that I ever had any experience with in my entire life. And everybody respected him. He ran the show, so to speak, in Barber County, at least in half of the county. So this was George Wallace, the circuit judge. He comes flying into that building and says, Judge, I got to see you. Said, I'm in trouble. So they go in and close the door, and I could hear the conversations. George Wallace says, Judge said, that judge is going to put me in jail. Said, I don't want to give him those records. Said, I want to be governor. He said, I don't want to go to jail. I said, what should I do? And Judge Williams, I could hear his very loud voice. He says, Wallace, I'll tell you one thing. He said, you get yourself in that car and get your he said something else other than rear end. He said, get your rear end up to Montgomery and give him those records. Don't know what happened. I know later Judge Wallace gave the records and later denied giving them. And I think there was a court case that I think it was later on that is reported in the books now as to actually the hearing when I believe Governor Wallace was represented by, said John Patterson. I'm not sure that's quite right, but Seymour Trammell, who later became finance director, a lawyer named Archie Grubbs from Eufaula, who was a very good lawyer, apolitical, not a political type. And they worked out some sort of deal with Judge Johnson, as I understand it, on those records. And that was my recollection of it came strictly from that warehouse setting. Yeah, in fact, I met him several times, never as a lawyer in his courtroom, but as lieutenant governor, I met him several times. And we had one connection that nobody even knew about. We had an employee that worked for my wife, Louise Duncan, whose mother worked for Mrs. Ruth Johnson. And for that reason, we developed a closeness that I never revealed to anybody except Judge Johnson later. And I did have an opportunity to meet with him in his office on several matters dealing with state business, where he was doing the right thing by forcing the state to take actions that otherwise would have never happened in several areas of concern. You'd have to sort of picture him, those glasses down over his nose, and he had a very stern look, and he was very candid, very forthright, brilliant person, intellectually gifted, and he knew exactly where he stood on every particular issue of any sort. And I was extremely impressed with him, and just had a genuine likeness. I just liked the man. And he later gave me some advice after I ran for governor and was defeated. And I give George Wallace full credit for making sure I was never governor. And he probably did me the best favor that he could probably, best thing he could have done for me was to get involved in my governor's race and make sure that I didn't make it. And I don't have any, I never had any hard feelings over that because I really, in retrospect, he did me a terrific favor. But after I got defeated, I was in debt. And I'd sent resumes out to every law firm that I dealt with as lieutenant governor. Got only one response, and that was from Truman Hobbs, who later became a federal judge, who said that, he said, we just don't have anything, but if we did, we'd consider you. Didn't get anything else. And I guess I got my feelings hurt. And I guess if I didn't have any humility, all of a sudden it hit me in the face. So I said, what should I do? And then Bob James, he and I had been friends before he ran for governor, and he was the winner. He won the race and became governor. He called me one day and said, Jerry, I know you're in debt. I know your wife and his wife, Bobby, were friends. And he said, I want to help you. He said, I'll create some type of job for you. Well, that obviously got my attention. And I thought about it. I really wanted to practice law. But I said, who can I turn to? And I thought, for whatever reason, I think the Lord led me to Judge Johnson. I really do. So I called and got an appointment, came up to see him in his office, and I told him my plight. I guess I was a lot of self-pity and threw it out on him. And he said, well, Jere said, don't you have a law degree? I said, yes, I do. He said, well, you practiced law back before you got in politics. I said, yes, I did. He said, well, I want you to look at the landscape. He said, Montgomery, where you live right now. He said, there's not a law firm in this town that does exclusively plaintiff practice, represent victims. Most of them either represent corporate America or banks or insurance, some type other than what I'm going to recommend for you. So we talked on further, and I said, well, what do you think I ought to do? He said, the first thing you need to do is, again, he used that same term that Marshall Williams had used with George Wallace. He said, son, said, get your rear end out of politics and practice law. Said, open an office and see what happens. He said, you've got ability, and if you are determined to do what you just told me you wanted to do, and that is help folks, get out there and do it. I went home, and my wife and I prayed about it, and I told her exactly what the judge had told me. And she says, you need to do exactly what he said. So I rented a little office over on Hull Street, opened a one-person office. Collectively just helping folks that need help. Let me just say this. Were it not for the judicial system and the courts of this country and the rule of law, the average American would not have a chance to get justice, fairness, and that's really what we do. We use the judicial system to help folks. And I look back over the years that we practiced and the type of practice we do. I'm going to tell you about one case, just to give you an idea. There was a case called Spivey versus Kubota back in the early 80s. I had known Durwood Spivey from Barber County, farmer, tough guy, big family. Had one son worked for the Department of Agriculture in Washington. And one Saturday, Durwood was doing some work not related to his farming. He had a little pond, and he had a tractor. It had no roll bars on it or seat belts. None of them did at that time. Not one company in the entire industry provided that type of protection. So he was out driving the tractor down toward the pond on a slight incline, and it turned over and actually pinned him down. This is July, mid-afternoon, and nobody knows he's there, and he dies from shock. And when they found him, ants were all over him. He was in pitiful shape. So they have his funeral, and I get a call from Mrs. Spivey. Her name was Dixie Merle Spivey. She says, Jere, I want you to help my family. Said, my son thinks we might have a claim against Kubota. I'll be honest, I could not see a claim for a farmer in Barber County, Alabama, suing a corporation for not putting a roll bar on its tractor or seat belts. And I found out that the only reason that they had decided for litigation was that he had called Kubota and tried to, if he had first written the president, got no response, and he tried calls and got no answers. And he's working for the Department of Agriculture, so he had some knowledge of the problem. So we decided to take a look at it. And Greg Allen, who's the best product liability lawyer, I think, in the country, happens to be in my firm, thank the Lord. Greg and I got the case, took the case. Greg did a lot of the preliminary investigation. He is a mechanical, technical genius. He figured out quickly that something needed to be done here to make this industry change. And we were looking at it two ways. One, to help Miss Spivey, and secondarily, and I'll admit it was a very low second, was to change the industry at that time, because this was early in our practice. So he takes a deposition of a gentleman, I cannot think of his exact name, but he was a vice president of the company, happened to be chairman of what they call the retrofit committee. The retrofit committee had the responsibility to analyze their situation, to make it. They would, first of all, they would project out, if we do nothing and we get sued, what will be the outcome financially? And next, if we decide to do the right thing and make these changes, retrofit what's out in the field now and also required on the new tractors, then it's going to cost us X number of dollars. They found out the cost of doing nothing was their best route financially, and that's what they did. So I get a call one day before he takes this deposition of this gentleman. And this company had been a safety consultant for Kubota, and they had recommended to this retrofit committee that they retrofit and then provide protection in the future. And they had rejected them and actually fired them. So he calls me and tells me about all of this and says, how would you like to have the minutes of the meetings? I said, well, send them to me. So he does, and we read them. So Greg takes a deposition of this man. He asks him names, goes through all the stuff. He says, tell me about the retrofit committee. He says, what? He says, tell me about the retrofit committee. This man says under oath, I don't know what you're talking about. He's the chairman. So Greg just takes him down the path of where he's headed and all these denials. And so we come back and we file a motion asking the judge to require Kubota to bring this man live to trial. And the order was granted, and he came. And the reason they didn't oppose it, they thought he was so slick that he'd come in and fool this jury. And so he was our first witness. And after his name and occupation and whatever, next question, were you chairman of the retrofit committee under oath in court? He says again, no. He says, well, didn't y'all have a retrofit committee? Under oath, no. So we then showed the minutes. And it was downhill from there. This was on Monday or Tuesday. So on Friday, we go through the entire trial because we wanted to have a good case on appeal because we assumed they would appeal. So Friday morning, we get to the courthouse, and Bill Allen from Birmingham, very good lawyer, comes, stops me. He says, Jere said, Kubota wants to settle your case. And Bill had called me to back up. he'd called me on Saturday when I was in the office getting ready for trial on Monday, and here's exactly what he told me. He said, Jere, you and I have been friends for several years. He says, even in your political days. And he said, I'm going to do you a favor. He said, we're not going to sue y'all for malicious prosecution. We're going to pay you $25,000 to pay your expenses, and this thing's got to go away. I said, Bill, we can't do that. So we'll go through the trial. So on Friday, he's waiting for me. And this is $10 million at that time, which today would be considerably more. He says they're going to pay your client $10 million, which is more money than you've ever even dreamed about in this case. But there's conditions. Total confidentiality, seal the record, return all those documents you stole from us. And that's it. I said, well, sounds good, but I got to talk to my client. So Greg and I go up and we talk to Miss Spivey, and she had all the children there. Told her. And she said, well, Jere said, you knew Durwood. I said, yes, ma'am, I did. Says, just reverse things. Suppose he was sitting here and I'd been the person killed and they'd made this offer to him. What do you think he'd tell you on the confidentiality part? And I said, well, I don't know. Tell me. She says he would say, you go tell him to keep the damn money. I'll admit, early in my career, I had never had to make that type of decision. So I go back downstairs and I told Bill exactly what she had told me. He says, you turning down $10 million? I said, we are turning down $10 million and we're going forward with this trial. And so he says, well, let me go, and I'm going to use the terminology he used. He says, let me go call the Japs. I said, I assume you're talking about Kubota. He said, I'm calling the man that's in California. I can't get into Japan at this time of day. So he calls and comes back and he says, we're going to settle it. Said, I hope you won't mention this much. Well, we did. In fact, we had a news conference the next Monday in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse, the state courthouse. We had all the news media there. Surprisingly, they came because they'd kept up with this trial. So back in those days, we didn't have all this modern technology. We had to blow up exhibits, and we had everything on easels blown up, showing how terrible Kubota had been on safety. So that story spread all over this country, all over the entire world, really. And so if you go back at that time frame and project out, say, 6 months, here's what you would have seen on Kubota's website. We have led the industry in providing safety protection for our tractors. We have now forced the rest of the industry to have roll bars, they call it ROPS protection, and seat belts on every tractor. And I can tell you without any doubt, without any reservation, if Mrs. Spivey had taken that $10 million, that would not have been on their website. And that, you ask me what stands out in my practice, I could give you hundreds of cases just exactly like that with a little bit of difference in the actual factual situation or how it transpired. But we have made more changes in the industries of America. It really has given me a satisfaction that I could have never gotten in politics. I guess I could have gotten some farming like I did for those 2 years. But as a lawyer, I cannot imagine doing a better job for America than what we have done in these types of cases. Had he not, first of all, he had the courage and the backbone and the desire to make sure that the rule of law applied in every situation to everybody. And he could have very easily dodged those responsibilities. In fact, he had opportunities to dodge those responsibilities. He did not in any way fall short. he, in my opinion, of all the judges, all the jurists at any level of the system, he has had probably more effect on civil rights and justice and the rule of law than any other single judge that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are others, but you'd have to put it in the context, the years that he lived doing this, the Klan being as active as they were. They tried to burn his house down, for example, put a cross in front, burned it, threatened his life. And I knew a lot of this from that relationship between the employees in my house and his house. And under constant protection because of what he faced. And yet he did things that, and I give my friend Fred Gray a great deal of credit for some of the things Judge Johnson was able to do because of Fred being involved in making it happen. Up to this point, probably the voting aspect. If we've let him down so badly and so ferociously, I'd say, when we should have had the same type of courage to make sure that we preserved what he made possible at that time, because he totally changed the system, and we've let that slip away to some extent. First of all, gave hope to people who had limited hope at that time. The bulk of those affected had no hope of anything ever changing. And his rulings made that change a reality and gave hope to people and gave opportunities to folks. For example, Fred's a good example. Fred could not get in any law school because of the segregation aspect at that time, and had to go to what some would say would not be the school he would have preferred to go to. There were all sorts of things that were shut out to folks who had the ability. In fact, I'll give you a prime example. U.W. Clement, a federal judge later, but at first, I guess he and Richmond Pearson would have been, other than Reconstruction, first two African-American members of the state Senate. And UW and I became very, very close friends during that time. And he had been involved as a student in the civil rights movement and had been very active. And he later became a lawyer and had the opportunity to advance, did great work as a lawyer, did good work in the Senate, but more importantly, became a federal judge and was able to put into reality things that he would have not been able to achieve otherwise, other than men like Fred Gray and Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. I guess just the fact of not being afraid and having the courage and the conviction to do what's right under any circumstance, regardless of what you face or regardless of all of the temptations to back away. I hate to think it would be probably uh, like it was in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, with limited opportunities for folks who badly want opportunity and want to take advantage of what everybody else has access to. I don't know. It's hard to really project into now how it would have been had not certain things happened, but certainly we've regressed in certain areas today in the entire country, not just in Alabama. And having lived during growing up, for example, born in 1935, grew up in a segregated South, served with a racist governor, and saw the bad things that could happen when you let hate and division dictate your course of action. And I see that creeping back in, not creeping back, it's there in America today. I would say the Lord put you where you were, and you did what He set you out to do. And you have been an inspiration to me and to thousands of others who have law degrees who can use those degrees and their abilities to help folks.